The focus of the talk this evening is on the relation between Hegel and the recent history of analytic philosophy, and also what we should think about the prospects for genuine convergence and cooperation between these two traditions. In short, how should we view Hegel in relation to contemporary analytic philosophy? So on the one hand, writing in the 70s, but I think continuing to hold the same today, the American philosopher Richard Bernstein has offered what might be called the optimistic view, which sees hope for ever greater rapprochement as analytic philosophy itself takes an increasingly Hegelian turn. On the other hand, more recently, Sebastian Gardner of this parish has argued strongly for the pessimistic view, claiming that there are fundamental differences in approach between analytic philosophy and German idealism generally, including Hegel, and that various attempts by prominent so-called analytic Hegelians to connect the two are misconceived. What we are faced with then, in fact, is an either-or. Analytic philosophy or Hegel. You can't have both. Gardner's claim in particular, and I'll explain more what this means as we go on, is that while analytic philosophy is predominantly naturalistic, which again I'll explain as we go on, the sort of soft naturalism, as he calls it, that has been attributed to Hegel is a delusion, both interpretatively, Hegel didn't hold such a view, and philosophically. And once this is seen through, the contrast between the two positions remains stark. My own suggestion, typically for an Hegelian perhaps, is to try and steer between the two options of optimism and pessimism here. That is, I'm going to try to say that Gardner is right to criticize the soft naturalism that has been attributed to Hegel, but we might be able to attribute to Hegel an Aristotelian naturalism instead, which avoids the problems of soft naturalism and gives some hope of continuing connection then between Hegel and contemporary analytic philosophy. So the hope is that Hegel's idealism is nonetheless close enough to naturalism to provide some bridge between Hegel and analytic philosophy, but not in the way that Bernstein identifies. Okay, so the structure of the talk is pretty simple. I'm going to talk about the Bernstein optimistic view first, then the Gardner pessimistic view, and then try and steer a middle way between them with my view. So let's start with Bernstein, the optimistic view. And this is sort of derived, and obviously then explains my slightly weird title, from an article of 1977 in the Review of Metaphysics, entitled by Bernstein, "Why Hegel Now?" And the article starts as follows: during the past decade, there has been an explosion of interest in Hegel. One can barely keep up with the new editions, translations, commentaries, and articles that have been appearing throughout the world. The reasons for this burst of scholarly activity vary in different cultural milieus, but the question is especially perplexing in the context of Anglo-American philosophy. If there is one philosopher who has been thought to be dead and buried, who embodied all the vice of the wrong way of philosophizing, who seemed to have been killed off by abuse and ridicule, and if any of you have read Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy, you'll sort of get the idea, it was Hegel. Now, in a way, a similar question might be posed now regarding Anglo-American philosophy, though perhaps not quite as strongly, because there's been a continuation in that explosion of interest that Bernstein identified in the 70s, with even more editions, translations, commentaries, articles, books, etc., appearing. And not only that, not only has the burst of scholarly energy continued, but so too has the attempt to actually employ Hegel in a constructive way within contemporary philosophical thinking, to treat Hegel as a valuable aid in moving philosophy forward, something that Russell, for example, would have viewed with horror. Now, in Bernstein's article, he not only gives reasons for why the Hegel revival of the 70s happens, but he also gives reasons for why it was set to continue and grow, And thus he presents, as I say, what I'm calling the optimistic view, that Hegelian thinking on the one hand and Anglo-American analytic philosophy on the other are set for greater and greater convergence. And Bernstein puts this forward by putting Hegel in a pretty familiar trajectory from Hume to Kant, as the positivist revival of Hume came to be replaced by the conceptual turn associated with Kant. And where Bernstein then quotes a well-known remark from Wilfrid Sellars, where Sellars says, now that philosophy has gone back to Kant for the second time, can a Hegelian trip be far behind? And Bernstein illustrates this claim by reference to what he calls contemporary philosophy of science, which he insists is more than a subspeciality of philosophy, but is instead, as he puts it, the locus of some of the most exciting and controversial epistemological and metaphysical disputes, where here Bernstein is writing in the shadow of the revolution in philosophy of science caused by Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolution that had appeared in 1962. So taking philosophy of science as central, Bernstein lists the following themes which he thinks point in an Hegelian direction and that fuel his optimism. First of all, he says various distinctions taken for granted by early logical positivists and empiricists concerning the nature of science have been put into doubt, such as the distinctions between observation and theory, historical and philosophical issues, science as knowledge and science as activity. Secondly, the criteria for scientific verification, falsification, or confirmation cannot be abstracted from their historical contexts. This is what, again, philosophy of science at the time was teaching us. Thirdly, scientific change involves anomalies and the clash of paradigms and theories. Fourthly, traditional conceptions of rationality do not apply to science as a rational activity. And finally, science takes place in a social context. And Bernstein, not unreasonably, sees in all those themes various Hegelian connections. The emphasis on the historical, the emphasis on movement, the emphasis on embodiment of cultures, and so on and so forth. All those, to anyone vaguely familiar with Hegel, will indeed sound like the right kind of thing. And also, in addition to that kind of connection, Bernstein mentions, again in a way that oddly dates perhaps the piece already, is that he talks about the theory of action, which again is another area, along with philosophy of science, where he thinks shows contemporary analytic philosophy of the time, of the 70s, was close to Hegelianism. And in particular, he thinks contemporary philosophers have come to see, as he puts it, that in attempting to account for what is distinctive about human action, or at least some types of human action, it is necessary to examine the ways in which actions themselves are constituted by rules, practices, and institutions. Where again he thinks that naturally leads to Hegel, for as he puts it, few philosophers have equaled Hegel in the passion with which he argued that the character and dynamics of human action must be understood within the context of intersubjective interaction. So again, just as contemporary philosophy of action of the time of the 70s was emphasizing this social dimension to action, that makes bringing Hegel in timely. Now, of course, things have actually changed since then, right? The heyday of, I remember the time when philosophy of science was the most exciting bit of philosophy. I don't think, well, with apologies to philosophers of science in the room, it's no longer at the center of things. It's moved to something more peripheral. So you might think, well, okay, so that's Bernstein's exciting diagnosis then, but things have changed, and so isn't this all rather out of date? But of course, Bernstein has gone on to write about these things, and he feels vindicated, right? Admittedly, things haven't quite worked out the way he predicted, but nonetheless, this enthusiasm for Hegel that he diagnosed then has continued to flourish, and he would now point, as he does, to the so-called Pittsburgh Hegelians like John McDowell and Robert Brandom, both of whom seem to combine analytic philosophy credentials with a serious interest in Hegel, and various scholars of Hegel of the sort of more analytic kind, like Robert Pippin and Terry Pinkard, again, are at the center of their field. So I think if you ask Bernstein now, are you as optimistic now as you were in the 70s about Hegel, he would say yes. And indeed, history has proved me right. Well, that's, for those of us who like Hegel, as it were, the good news. But there's some interesting bad news. A markedly different story about how we should view the relation between analytic philosophy and Hegel. And this comes from Sebastian Gardner, who in a couple of excellent pieces has, in effect, poured a fair bit of cold water on this kind of enthusiasm. Now, at the centre of Gardner's pessimism, I think, is the claim that the outlook of contemporary analytic philosophy is essentially naturalistic, whereas that of idealism in general, including Hegel's idealism, is not. And where for Gardner the fundamental division comes over the question concerning value, and is thus a matter of axiology, which again he puts at the heart of the debate and of the development of German idealism itself. Now, of course, to say exactly what naturalism is notoriously hard to do in any uncontentious way, as are defining its precise parameters. Is it a metaphysical doctrine, a methodological doctrine, or some sort of disciplinary claim? So does it concern what there is, how we go about investigating what there is, or how the sciences, or maybe natural science, stand in connection to other disciplines? So naturalism can encompass all those thorny issues. But the way Gardner introduces it is to take his lead from a 1919 paper by the well-known Kant translator and scholar Norman Kemp Smith, who defines these terms in a certain kind of way. And of course, Kemp Smith is writing at a period where these divisions and these debates are starting to crystallize. And Kemp Smith defines the naturalist as somebody, as the view that, quote, man is a being whose capacities, even in their highest activities, are intelligible only as exercise exclusively in subordination to the specific requirements of his terrestrial environment. Right, so that's not quite the definition you would pick up in a sort of standard philosophy textbook now, but it's in a way interestingly different, and nonetheless bears some connection to what you might find now. On the other hand, idealism is defined as the view that its supreme concern is to show that the aesthetic and spiritual values have a more than merely human significance, so that man is measured against standards for which his natural environment cannot account. So as Gardner sets things up following Kemp Smith, the crucial issue concerns the nature of value and whether they are absolute and unconditioned and hence independent of our particular human needs, interests and terrestrial concerns, or whether they somehow fundamentally rests on those. Now, Gardner argues, viewed clear-headedly, there is no way to bring these two views together. That's why this is an either-or. And indeed, that seems right on the first blush, as it were, certainly if we put them in the standard Euthyphro-type format, where on the one hand, naturalism could be seen as the view that what has value is fixed by what we as humans determine ourselves by in the light of our prior interests and concerns, whereas the idealist says we determine ourselves by what has value, which things have prior to our interests and concerns. So again, that way looks like a pretty clear contrast. And nonetheless, what Gardner thinks has gone wrong, as it were, or what has sort of muddied that clarity, is that there's been a blurring of that contrast by the rise of what he calls soft naturalism, which wants to combine elements of both views. And the essential features of that soft naturalism, as Gardner characterizes it, is as follows. The philosophical vindication of the phenomena can be provided by something other than ontological grounding, and which instead involves essential reference to the subject or a perspective relative to which internal perspectival reality can be claimed for the phenomena. So I think the idea is that, as it were, internally or inside to a practice or within a certain way of going on, value has a kind of reality on this perspective, on this view, but viewed externally, viewed from the perspective of the universe as such, as it were, it doesn't. But I mean, in a way that doesn't matter because we're within the practice. So as long as it has a kind of reality to us, that's all that you really need to be bothered about. But Gardner thinks this position is ultimately unstable and incoherent because it can't in the end fend off the attractions of hard naturalism, naturalism proper, as it were. For in trying to find a place for values within nature as conceived by the sciences, in the end it can only do so by introducing a perspectival element into an account of those values, but which then makes them less than real from the standpoint of the hard naturalist, where then a move to fully non-naturalistic idealism is required if the hard naturalist is to be properly countered. So soft naturalism is a kind of delusion. If you're really going to have anything ultimately to say against the hard naturalist, you better be a fully fledged idealist and abandon your compromise view. So this is how Gardner puts it. The reflexive move, the reference back to the reality of such and such to our concepts, our practices, taken on their own, thus misses the point. The hard naturalist will reasonably reply that it is not in doubt that our concepts and practices weigh with us, but that the whole issue concerns what it means in the overall scheme of things for something to be a practice of ours. What are we, the hard naturalists, ask, such that the fact of a representational practice being ours is supposed to raise its status, not merely in the trivial sense of its having status in our eyes, but in the sense of its ranking alongside the hard reality of natural science? The metaphysical significance of the soft naturalist use of the first person plural, we, has to be shown, not merely asserted. Now, once hard naturalism and idealism emerge as the only and competing options, and once it's accepted that analytic philosophy must gravitate to the former pole, to naturalism, then Bernstein's optimism just looks too rosy, naive, and hopeless, and to just been brought at the price of a kind of confusion. Because what made the convergence of analytic philosophy and idealism seem plausible was the claim that this idealism is less metaphysically rebarbative than it may once have seemed, where so-called metaphysical readings of Hegel and others have been replaced by the sort of socialized and historicized form of idealism that Bernstein so admires, often dubbed non-metaphysical. But, Gardner argues, if idealism is to hold on to the axiological commitments that are so distinctive of it, and if it can only do so by standing up properly against hard naturalism, then it must go beyond any such non-metaphysical view and must instead ground the values it champions in a clearly anti-naturalist commitment to something beyond the human perspective, namely a perspective of absolute spirit, at which point the hope of any rapprochement with analytic philosophy has been well and truly lost. Once the idealist starts talking about absolute spirit, then people are going to tune out entirely. So, pointing to texts in which Hegel appears to robustly set Geist, spirit, prior to and outside nature, Gardner argues that this is no accident, but precisely what one would expect, given the realism about value that he and the other idealists wanted to maintain in the first place, a realism that cannot be maintained by soft naturalism and thus by non-metaphysical readings of the idealist position. Now, in citing Norman Kemp Smith, Gardner is right to see him as speaking for a kind of orthodoxy within the British idealist tradition of which Kemp Smith was a part. And certainly many other members of this group would have shared Kemp Smith's view of idealism and its relation to questions of value. So just to give you one more example to try and get across the idea, one of many that I've found. This is from James Seth, writing in 1905. The metaphysics of ethics may be either naturalistic or idealistic. On the one hand, the law of human life may be reduced to terms of natural law. The moral ideal may be resolved into the reality of nature. Or, on the other hand, right, this isn't kind of both, right, this is Gardner either or, the ultimate measure of human conduct and character may be found in a spiritual order which transcends the natural. The moral ideal may be found to express a divine reality to which the real world of nature would, in itself, give no clue. Thus, an adequate interpretation of morality compels us to predicate an ultimate and absolute moral reality, a supreme ground of goodness as well as of truth. And the moral idealism which we have maintained against empirical realism in ethics brings us in the end to a moral realism, to a conviction of the reality of the moral ideal. So I think, Sebastian's absolutely right that had soft naturalism been put to these guys in 1900s or whatever, they would have said, that's ridiculous, it's one or the other. And interestingly, there are some contemporary philosophers, mainly working in philosophy of religion, who would say the same. But of course, in a way, they would, wouldn't they? But John Cottingham, basically writing in, this is 2014, makes the same kind of move. Right? So he says here, what does it mean, however, to say that God is the source of goodness? To begin with, it evidently implies a firm denial of relativism. If goodness derives from an objective being that exists independently of us, then this rules out pragmatic and relativistic conceptions, according to which the good is simply what works for us or what is currently approved of in our culture circle. Nor can the good be something we can create or invent by our own choices or act of will in the way Friedrich Nietzsche envisaged. But in addition to underwriting objectivity and non-relativity, the idea of a divine source of goodness also implies a certain kind of authority. This connects with the notion, by no means confined to theists, that beauty and goodness exert some kind of normative pull on us. Beauty is to be admired, goodness is to be pursued. These values, in a certain sense, constrain us, whether we like it or not. So if you're going to take values seriously in a certain kind of way, the thought is the only way of doing so is to introduce some essentially theological notion into your metaphysics. No naturalist is going to buy that, therefore it's idealism or naturalism. So if we put Hegel in this tradition, as Gardner suggests we should, with its clear anti-naturalism, Gardner's pessimism seems absolutely justified. The reconciliationist agenda, so hoped for by Bernstein in the 70s and championed by people like McDowell, Brandon, Pippin, Pinkard and many others, must therefore be abandoned and all such hopes dashed upon the rocks. Okay. Well, here's the middle way then. Is there space for a qualified optimism here? Is there space for a naturalistic reading of Hegel that is more metaphysically robust and demanding, as it were, than soft naturalism, and thus less in need of idealism based on the strong conception of Geist as spirit in any quasi-theistic sense? So go back to Gardner's objections to soft naturalism. Gardner quotes Terry Pinkard, a leading American Hegel commentator, as treating Geist as us, qua historically located human beings. But Gardner then challenges this approach as giving the values that we may then institute a treatment that is altogether insufficiently absolute and objective, and thus leaves the position vulnerable to hard naturalism. So again, this is the Gardner objection in another form. The hard naturalist will claim once again that no reason has been given for thinking that there is not a naturalistic explanation to be given for the emergence of normativity from nature, in the light of which it can be seen that what emerges is not Geist or normativity as Hegelians conceive it, something with real autonomy, but simply our representing ourselves in geistig normative terms. The sophisticated naturalist may grant, furthermore, that an appearance of autonomy and absoluteness is built into the perspective of Geist or normativity, and then claim that it is this which leads to the illusory view that Geist or normativity is independent from nature in the strong absolute sense affirmed by Hegelians. So Gardner argues, as we've seen, that for Hegel himself this problem does not arise because on Hegel's metaphysical conception of Geist as outside and prior to nature and as therefore absolute in itself, the kind of value and normativity it institutes suffers from no such relativity. But of course, this requires a metaphysical and non-naturalistic reading of Hegel's position that sets him at odds with the analytic mainstream. Okay, so the normal thing to do when faced with this kind of impasse is look for some shared assumption both sides make and try and undercut that and then open up some unseen options. And that's basically what I'm going to try and do. So one assumption that both Gardner and his opponents seem to share is that on the Hegelian picture, value and normativity are instituted by Geist or spirit or mind or whatever you want to call it, on a natural world that is intrinsically or left to itself non-normative, where Geist is then either understood in a deflationary sense as just us, or in an inflationary sense as absolute spirit or something theological or whatever. Then that leaves the issue whether the former view, the deflationary view, can keep the axiological commitments of German idealism in a sufficiently strong sense, or whether you can have to move to the latter view. But what I want to do, as I say, is question the shared assumption. Because I think it's possible to see value in Hegel arising in a different, more Aristotelian way, as relating to claims about the natures of things and how well or badly they realize those natures. Very roughly and quickly, and I'll develop it a bit more as we go on this sort of view, evaluative claims are based on comparisons between objects as they actually are and the kinds or types of objects they belong to, where the latter, it has to bring in with it normative implications. Given realism about these kinds, the kinds that things belong to, a view of this sort can then also claim to be realist about normative judgments based on, in a way that escapes Gardner's worries about value being tied to the human perspective as needing to be imposed on a natural world that in itself is alien to normativity. So this then also counts as a metaphysical view, given the ontological commitments it involves. But the ontological commitments are not primarily to Geist in some non-natural sense, but to kinds and essences and types. At the same time, it's a metaphysical view that perhaps at least has some chance of being made compatible with naturalism in some form, or at least so contemporary proponents of this sort of approach, this sort of naturalism, such as Philippa Foot and Michael Thompson in the analytic tradition, might lead one to expect. At any rate, there seems to be more room for hope here than with the appeal to Geist that is required on Gardner's view, where this may then make something like Bernstein's optimism regarding the rapprochement with analytic philosophy more plausible, though on grounds that are still very different from the ones he offered originally. So it may turn out both sides in this debate are partly right but also partly wrong, so that each must make some concessions to the other. Gardner can keep his metaphysical reading of Hegel, but must move to a metaphysical reading that can build bridges with naturalism and hence analytic philosophy. Bernstein and his fellow deflationary readers of Hegel must give up on their non-metaphysical approach. It's not all just about history and culture and all the rest of it, but can retain their sense of optimism. And both sides are wrong regarding the view of value that Hegel wants to defend. Okay, so to make that plausible, we have to say something about Hegel on value that falls in this middle ground, as it were. And that's what I want to do next. Now, I think the best way to approach Hegel's view of value is, well, a relatively hard road, in a sense, but via Hegel's logic, which of all the bits of Hegel, perhaps leaving aside the philosophy of nature, is sort of the more intimidating bit of the system and quite reasonably gets left on the side. But it is basically the engine room of Hegel's system, right? That is really what it all fundamentally hangs on. And in his logic, we have a treatment of, at the end of the logic, of what Hegel calls concept, begriff, judgment, and syllogism. That might lead you to think Hegel's logic is indeed a bit like logic, but that's not entirely so. But this bit sort of is, although it has a lot of metaphysical underpinnings, as we'll see. Now, in this bit of the logic, Hegel offers a hierarchy of the forms of judgment and syllogism, based on how they see the relation between the conceptual moments of what Hegel calls universal, particular, and individual. So let me try and explain this if I can. So at the simplest and most basic level, judgments and syllogisms involve claims about individuals and their simple properties, such as this road is red, or this rose is red, red is a colour, therefore this rose is coloured. Right? A very simple judgment, tedious, pretty boring judgment. A very simple syllogism, pretty boring syllogism. Now, Hegel holds, for reasons I can't go into here, that it is basically not possible to just make judgments of this kind and syllogisms of this kind. But in fact, you're going to have to make more sophisticated judgments and syllogisms than this. And they're going to have to involve more complex conceptual structures. In particular, you're going to have to move towards making judgments and thinking about individual objects as instantiating natural kinds, which characterize their essential natures. And the significance of that for our purposes tonight is that that essentially brings in or incorporates an evaluative element. Because to understand a concept as representing a natural kind is to understand individuals falling under that kind in terms of certain characteristics, where failing to possess those characteristics is then a fault or a defect in the individual qua member of its kind. So, for example, a rose that dies prematurely or which fails to attract sufficient bees to be pollinated or is odourless but belongs to a species with a scent, apologies to any gardeners out there, I hope that's roughly biologically right, is a bad or defective rose. But where these norms are not based on mere statistical generalization, right? When you say this is a bad rose, it's not because you've counted all the roses there are and it turns out enough of them have got scent. It's based on the proper functioning of roses as members of that kind. So it reflects claims about what it is for a rose to be, of this species, to be a proper exemplar of the kind of thing it is. Now, if we take that approach seriously, and remember, this is the end of the logic. So this is a sort of high point, really, of Hegel's system. I mean, some things happen after this in the logic, but arguably, as far as this kind of stuff goes, this is the top of the tree, right? Now, value enters only at this point in Hegel's discussion. And he introduces it precisely in these terms. So this is when he's talking about judgments, we have this comment. Here we have the apodeictic judgment, e.g. this, the immediate singularity, house, the genus, being constituted thus and so, particularity, is good or bad. Right? So this thing here, right, which has got a leaky roof and windows falling out and collapsing walls, is a bad house. All things are a genus, which is their determination and purpose, in a single actuality with a particular constitution. And their finitude consists in the fact that what is their particular way of being may or may not conform to the universal. So value here is just understood in terms of how you, well or badly, you exemplify the universal of which you are a member. And similarly, in the science of logic, you have the same comment, or same kind of comment. The subject of the apodeictic judgment, the house constituted so-and-so is good, the action constituted so-and-so is right, has within it first the universal, what it ought to be, and secondly its constitution. This latter contains the ground why a predicate of the notion, judgment, applies or does not apply to the whole subject. That is, whether the subject corresponds to its notion, or that should be concept, or not. This judgment then is truly objective, or it is the truth of the judgment in general. So the only time in a way for Hegel you get to an objective judgment is when you make this kind of value judgment. Now, as far as I know, these are the only passages in the main part of the logic, Hegel's key texts, in which issues of value of this kind are addressed and explained. Now, passages of this sort may then be compared to the following passages from contemporary neo-Aristotelian naturalists like Foot and Thompson. So Philippa Foot, in her well-known book Natural Goodness, says things like this. Natural goodness, as I define it, which is attributable only to living things themselves and to their parts, characteristics and operations, is intrinsic or autonomous goodness in that it depends directly on the relation of an individual to the life form of its species. And another passage, thus evaluation of an individual living thing in its own right, with no reference to our interests or desires, is possible where there is intersection of two types of proposition. On the one hand, Aristotelian categoricals, life form descriptions relating to the species, and on the other, propositions about particular individuals that are the subjects of evaluations. And notice that claim about no reference to our interests or desires. We'll come back to that. And here's another slightly longer passage from Michael Thompson. If, though, we want to apply normative categories to sub-rational nature and apart from any relation to our interests, then the question inevitably arises, and not so unreasonably, where does the standard come from? What supplies the measure? The system of natural historical propositions with a given kind or form as subject supplies such a standard for members of that kind. We may implicitly define a certain very abstract category of natural defect with the following simple-minded principle of inference. From the S is F and this is not F, to infer this S is defective in that it is not F. It is in this sense that natural historical judgments are normative, and not by each propositions bearing some sort of secret normative infrastructure. The first application of concepts of good, bad, defect and pathology is to the individual, and it consists in a certain sort of reference of the thing to its form or kind and the natural history that pertains to it. And then finally from Hursthouse, I mean, there's a kind of gang of three here, right? So Hursthouse is also part of this position. Says, first, the truth of such evaluations of living things does not depend in any way on my wants, interests, or values, nor indeed on ours. They are, in the most straightforward sense of the term, objective. Indeed, given that botany, zoology, ethnology, etc. are scientific, they are scientific. So let me just try and say something briefly about what's distinctive of this view before turning to some problems with it, finally, both in itself and as a reading of Hegel. So first of all, I think this would count as a broadly metaphysical view. It gives a realist account of values, and it involves certain kinds of metaphysical machinery, like kinds, essences, and so on, that underpin that realism. So there are metaphysical commitments here. This is not a non-metaphysical view, either in itself or of Hegel, if it's right about Hegel. Secondly, while the view may constitute a challenge to naturalism in some reductive and anti-metaphysical forms, so some naturalists will abhor talk of essences, kinds, essential properties, and all the rest of it. So some naturalists clearly will be horrified by this, but the thought is that not all will be, and it still counts, again, as a broadly naturalist view. So on the one hand, it's more dialectically stable, arguably, than soft naturalism, but it's not as wholly opposed to naturalism as the idealist conception that Gardner, for example, proposes. Thirdly, I think it's hard for this not to end up as a form of eudaimonism, because there's meant to be a conceptual link between being a proper exemplar of the kind and doing well or flourishing as an individual, such that if we were to treat X as a member of a kind but find that doing so in accordance with norms of that kind lead X not to flourish, then we would have to change our account of the kind to which it belongs. So if I treat this plant as a house plant and it wilts and dies, well then I'm clearly wrong, it's not a house plant. Fourthly, Hegel's position, I think, brings out the links between individuals and kinds and value in a kind of transcendental way, in the sense that I think he wants to make the claim, which is why it has this particular position it does in the logic, that to have the concept of an individual, a genuine concept of an individual, you have to see the individual as exemplifying a kind, and to have that you must be able to see it as doing it well or badly, and to have that you already have to have normative commitments. Right? So normativity isn't a sort of bolt-on extra that you can have a view of the world with no normativity and then introduce it on top. It's constitutive of having concepts of things in the first place that you have normativity along with it. And then fifthly, I think, again, in contrast to a view like Bernstein's, this is not an historicist position, I think, ultimately. So we saw when we talked about Bernstein at the beginning, what Bernstein liked about Hegel and what he thought gave Hegel a ticket into modern philosophy was his historicism, his sense of history, the way that we're all just part of a culture and those cultures are constantly changing and so on and so forth. I don't think this view is historicist in that sense, right? Because I think it's committed to a certain view, as we'll see in a minute, of what it is to flourish as a human being. And that, in a way, is not something that is going to vary qua human being. Okay, so that's a way of reading Hegel that might sort of steer between the two opposing sides that we had at the beginning. What I want to do finally in the last little bit is to consider some objections to this, both in a way as a view, but also as a reading of Hegel. Now, of course, I can't do everything here, and I'm not capable of doing everything here. If I had a beautiful, totally, fully worked out defense of this view, I would have given you that instead. But what I want to focus on more are the problems with it that might push us back in the idealist direction that Gardner thinks we're going to have to, get to grips with. So are there issues with this kind of Aristotelian naturalism that in the end mean that to make it work, again, it's just as unstable as soft naturalism. In the end, you're going to have to either be a hard naturalist or an idealist in the more, let's call it, quasi-theistic sense. So here are three worries you might have about the view that you might think will push it in that kind of direction. And I'll say something about them and then respond to them. So the first is that Aristotelian naturalism is implausibly biologistic. And to make it less so is to move from naturalism to idealism. I'll explain all these in a second. Secondly, Aristotelian naturalism's conception of nature is incompatible with modern conceptions of nature, particularly in its commitment to some form of teleology. And to save teleology, you have to move to, again, a stronger form of idealism of the sort Gardner puts forward. Thirdly, Aristotelian naturalism involves a degree of relativism when it comes to our moral practices, which again is incompatible with the absoluteness of moral value and norms that then again are going to require a more theistic, let's call it, idealism for its defense. So the thought here is that each of these criticisms shows that Kemp Smith and Gardner can argue that Aristotelian naturalism, like soft naturalism, needs to give way to idealism of a different kind, of a deeply non-naturalistic kind, and again we're back to our either-or. Okay, so let me just say something about each of those worries. So the first worry is the worry about biologism. The first objection is that Aristotelian naturalism is committed to an implausibly biologistic view of us as agents, as if, as life forms, we could be understood in terms of purely biological imperatives, such as reproduction and the norms that arise from that. And this is a worry Foot herself is aware of. She says, the question remains, however, as to whether once we have made the transition from sub-rational to rational beings, we may not need a new theory of evaluation. Surely, my critics will say, it must be so. For such an evaluation of sub-rational beings is based on the general relation of this kind of feature to the pattern of life that is the good of creatures of this species. But how can we possibly see human goods in the same terms? The life cycle of a plant or animal ultimately has nothing to do, ultimately has to do with what is involved in development, self-sustenance and reproduction. Are we really going to suggest that human strengths and weaknesses, and even virtues and vices, are to be identified by reference to such biological cycles? So more radically, it can be argued that even if Aristotelian naturalism worked for animals, we are a special case, as human beings can always transcend their biology and indeed any essentialist claims altogether. Our existence precedes our essence, as Sartre said. So as Foot says, there will be this kind of objection. There will surely be the objection to the idea that a natural form of life characteristic of humankind could determine what you or I ought to do. What does it matter to me what species I belong to? Should we not protest on behalf of individuality and creativity against bringing in the human species when asking what I myself, this particular person, should do? Now, when it comes to Hegel, I think the response to this might be an interesting one. Namely, on the one hand, I think it's right that Hegel moves beyond thinking of us as purely biological creatures. That's absolutely right. He thinks of us, broadly speaking, as agents or persons, which is much more than merely the biological. That's true. And in his account of us, which again I won't have time to discuss, again he gives a particular kind of answer to what it is for human beings to flourish, which depend on a particular structure of the will as he understands it. But the point is that you can accept that thought, that Hegel's conception of our flourishing is not the same as if we were purely biological creatures, but still think he has an account of human flourishing and a human essence, such that it's sufficient to underpin this kind of naturalism. So that's my response to the first worry. The second worry is the worry about teleology. Look, isn't this kind of story going to need teleology? And isn't teleology something, again, that no naturalist in the end is going to accept, because it seems to precisely bring in the idea of a creator? So Foot says, philosophers are sometimes afraid of recognizing teleological language, thinking it must be left over from a worldview in which all nature was seen as reflecting the will of the deity. So of course, if that's right, then you've got to bring in, again, a quasi-theistic story, and we're back to Gardner's form of idealism in some sense. Now, of course, interpretively, that might not seem so much a worry about Hegel, because Hegel's pre-Darwin. Maybe we've got these concerns and assumptions, but why think Hegel did, right? So Hegel, as it were, might perfectly happily trotted out, as indeed he does, teleological stuff. As an interpretative point, that may not seem so strong, except, of course, even in Hegel's time, and Kant is the prime example, there are already worries about teleology. So you can't quite get Hegel off the hook that way. But in fact, and again, I can't really go into this, in the contemporary literature, there's some really interesting discussions of Hegel and teleology that, on the one hand, say, yes, Hegel is committed to teleology, but on the other hand, say he's committed to it precisely because he's got interesting and indeed perhaps plausible arguments against non-teleological forms of explanation. So yes, Hegel's a teleologist, but that may not be because he's a creationist, as it were. It may just be he thinks teleology is a decent form of explanation. End of story. Finally, the third worry is a worry about where all this leads value, and particularly moral value, in the end. And we can sort of focus this worry by going back to Kemp Smith. Because Kemp Smith admits in his article that naturalism, has a lot going for it. Even though he thinks ultimately you've got to be an idealist, there's a lot to be said for naturalism. And in particular, he says naturalism can now profess to meet idealism on more equal terms within its, idealism's own field, that of our specifically human activities, because it can, quote, trace more distinctions to social conventions adopted for their beneficial consequences in forwarding the secular welfare of the individual and society. So, for example, Foot is speaking, if you like, of a naturalist of that kind when she talks about promising as, quote, a tool invented by humans for the better conduct of their lives. Much like waggle dancing, the funny little thing the bees do when they're doing whatever they're doing in beehives. That's, again, a norm for bees because it's a crucial part of a practice of their survival, and hunting in packs is crucial to wolves and all the rest of it. But it's clear from Kemp Smith's article that he thinks this can't satisfy the idealist ultimately, because it again leaves values too terrestrial and relativistic, as presumably different creatures could have different needs or ways of going on, such that for promising, for example, for them would no longer be a norm. Right? You can imagine worlds where promising would be irrelevant, pointless, not a norm. Well, that's a kind of relativism that may worry the idealist of, certainly does seem to worry the idealist of Kemp Smith's variety. So, for example, Kemp Smith writes, the supreme concern of idealism is to show that the aesthetic and spiritual values have a more than merely human significance. And naturalism has to treat human values as merely relative. Idealism interprets them as it's disclosing a richer and more comprehensive universe than can be studied in scientific terms. Thus, though man can indeed be studied only in his natural setting, for an understanding of his nature and destiny, idealism refers to that wider reality which is depicted in poetry and the arts and worshipped in religion, and which, though not yet scientifically known, can be philosophically discerned as conferring upon human life its standards and values. So for Kemp Smith, then, natural goodness in the Foot sense is, again, a kind of illusion and a kind of failure, because in the end, its conception of norms and value are going to turn out to be too, as it were, species, local, too relativistic. Where does Hegel stand on all this? Well, again, it seems to me that Hegel's account of norms is ultimately, while different in many important ways, can ultimately be equated to Foot's account, in the sense that if you read the philosophy of right, so philosophy, Hegel's main sort of ethical stroke political social work, the structure of society as presented there is of a system of practices of various kinds designed to lead to human flourishing as Hegel, in his perhaps rather curious way that I didn't get a chance to spell out in any detail, understands that flourishing to be. So in many ways, and I won't read this out because I'm running out of time, but just as Foot thinks that there are certain norms of animal behavior that are needed by those animals in order to survive and flourish as a kind, similarly, I think you can read Hegel's philosophy of right as presenting a kind of social structure that we need as human beings to flourish properly as creatures of our kind. Now, even if that's so, you might think, even if that story is to be found in Hegel, there's a fundamental and ultimate weakness to it, which again will still lead you back to idealism, which is that in the end, it's unless you see reality itself as in some way a created reality, that the value of our lives and our well-being can ultimately matter. Right? So it's all very well to say, look, wolves will only survive this way, bees will only survive that way, human beings will only survive the other way, and therefore these norms and practices have a kind of value for them, and that there are good and bad ways of being a bee, a wolf, and a human being. But you might think none of that matters unless reality itself is created. And that, I think, is the kind of thing that, again, somebody like John Cottingham, who I mentioned earlier, would say about this. Well, of course, at that point, I kind of give up in a way. I mean, how one would resolve that kind of confrontation of views is a really interesting question. I think in the end, and of course, again, on the Gardner side, Gardner might say, and maybe will say, yeah, precisely so, and that's why in the end Hegel's whole metaphysics ultimately pans out in a kind of creation story. But that itself is, as everybody will know who's ever looked at Hegel, you know, in a hugely debatable matter. Hegel can be read in many different ways on that kind of question. I think that, again, there is a way of telling the naturalist story of the kind of naturalism I've been characterizing that can make sense of value in a way that is still objective and non-relativistic, right? Which it is, right? It's not it's not because we like certain things that certain norms are required, because they're required for our survival and our flourishing. And that's not good because we like it. That's just built into the normativity of the kinds of things we are. So there is a kind of non-relativism and objectivism there, as Foot and Thompson said in some of the quotes I gave you. The ultimate question is whether, yeah, you've got all this objectivity of value, but still it doesn't really matter unless nature itself is created in some form. Now, then the question is, would that really ultimately help? I mean, why? And then, of course, we get into all sorts of theological questions that perhaps you did have the last session with Aquinas. Okay, so just to very briefly recap, as I say, I set out a kind of contrast of views, the optimism of Bernstein, the pessimism of Gardner, trying to steer the middle way by offering you a kind of naturalistic reading of Hegel on the one hand that is nonetheless metaphysically reasonably ambitious, but not so ambitious or so, I guess, unusual that modern philosophers or modern analytic philosophers are unable to take it seriously. The question at the end is whether in the end that stands up to the Gardner-like probing question, whether either interpretatively or philosophically that even that kind of position can remain stable. And that's, I guess, what we'll hear about in the discussion. So thanks.